Turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12. We're going to read the rest of the book of Genesis. I'm just kidding. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. While you're turning to Genesis chapter 12. Wednesday nights have been amazing. The book of Daniel, I have so much more respect for it. But last Wednesday was a topper for me. Earl had done some study on Daniel chapter 11, and that chapter, Gabriel comes to Daniel during Babylonian captivity, and so that's about 450 years before Jesus would come, and we know that after that, God goes silent. But what God does to Daniel is he unpacks quite specifically what's going to happen with nations both north and south of Israel. And he says, you know, so-and-so is going to try to rise up, but he's not going to make it. So-and-so is going to give his daughter in marriage, but he's not going to make it. And then the king from the south is going to do this, and then some of the Jews are going to try to revolt, and it's very specific. One king is going to send a tax collector, and quite specific. Doesn't mention any names, but he unpacks prophetically 400 years so that Israel would have peace of mind that though God isn't saying anything nationally to them right now, he knows exactly what's happening. And it's so encouraging for now because you hear about the Prince of Persia who had just conquered Babylon. And then the Prince of Greece Gabriel says, I'm going to go and I'm going to conquer the Prince of Persia because that kingdom is over. And he's talking in the Spirit. He's talking about the authorities and principalities that Paul is talking about in Ephesians 6. And he says, but the king of Greece, or the Prince of Greece, the demon that is over Greece, I'm going to let him rise up because it's their turn now. And then later, he doesn't say this, but we know through the other dreams that later they're going to conquer the Prince of Greece in the heavenlies, and then the Prince of Rome is going to rise up. And that's very important because it shows that God is in control and he's writing his story. So now that we look at today's day and we know that our battle isn't against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of this dark world, we know that God is orchestrating the Prince of Hamas, the Prince of Israel, the Prince of Sudan, the Prince of Ukraine, the Prince of Russia. And God is orchestrating it all with his armies, and humans are just following suit. God is in control. And this book of Daniel, and Earl did all of the historical work to match the prophetic word in Daniel 11. And it is unbelievable. It's mind-boggling that God would detail what's going to happen. And now in hindsight, we can look at those 400 years and go, God knew exactly. And they weren't godly men that he was rising up. He was using their evil, their deceit. He was using their pride and their greed and their power-hungry egos to get his job done. I get so excited. So that was last Wednesday. Absolutely amazing. And we're going to continue on. Once we're finished the book of Daniel, which is only a couple weeks away, I'm going to teach on the story of the Old Testament. It's split into history books, poetry books, and then prophetic books. So what you do is you take all the history books and you tell the story, right from Adam and Eve to Daniel in the lion's den, essentially. That's not the final story. There's a couple more after that, but you tell the story, which I'm going to do a little bit this morning. And then you put all of the poetic books and where they were written in that story, in the timeline, so you have a better understanding. And then you put all the prophetic books in that story. What was going on, once you know the story, the Old Testament just comes alive. And if we have time before the summer break, we'll do that with the New Testament as well. Because the story is the Gospels and then the book of Acts. And all those other books, my old Bible, I had in the book of Acts, Paul wrote Corinthians here. Paul wrote Thessalonians here. Because you can put all those books into the story once you know the story. The Bible's awesome. Absolutely awesome. Genesis chapter 12. Been looking forward to this. Start right at verse 1. We're just going to read what God says to Abram. Now this is Abraham before God changes his name to Abraham. So this is Abram. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God, anoint your word. This was spoken to God. God hadn't said this, he didn't say this to anyone, but God did ask one other to do something for him, and that was Abram's father. Abram's father, God said, "I want you to go to Canaan." And they started in the land of Chaldean, in the land of Uz. And instead of going all the way to to Canaan, Abram's father went north and went to Haran, and he stopped. So what does God do next? "I'm going to call your son." When God calls you to do something, don't stop short. So God now has his eyes focused on Abram, and I can't wait to ask him why. Why out of all the peoples on the earth did you choose Abram? But we know why he stuck with Abram, because listen to what he asked Abram to do. Now he's north with his father in Haran, and he's now going to go to a foreign country into Canaan, close to the Mediterranean Sea, in between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, so where he doesn't know anybody. He says, this is verse 1, "Go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you." And the reason God stuck with him is because Abram went. He took his wife, took his nephew Lot, and he left. He left his land. He left comfort. He left his family. He left everything that he knew, and he went to Canaan. And we'll find out later in the Word that God loved Abram's simple faith, his belief system. It said Abram believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. We also know by his biography in the book of Genesis that Abram was not a perfect man. He made some mistakes. But God saw him as righteous because he believed God at his word. That's powerful. So God gives him this promise. "I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now, a couple things happen. Abram is 75 years old at this point with no children. His wife can't have children. She's barren. Sarai, who's later named Sarah by God, Sarai is barren. Now, she's about 70 years old herself. So not only is she barren, she's gone through menopause. So now there's a double whammy. You're not having any kids. Abram, we always talk about the woman, he's 75 years old. I think some things have dried up. So you have this impossible promise. It was impossible, folks. Actually, let me digress. I love the fact that God raised up Israel through 3 generations, not just one with Sarah, 3 generations of barren. Sarai was barren. They end up, God opens up her womb. They have Isaac. He marries Rebekah. Rebekah is barren. She opens up her womb, has twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob gets the promise and the blessing. Jacob, his beloved wife Rachel, barren. And we don't think about that. We think of Rachel, we think of Rebekah, we think of Sarai. But you put them all together, you have an impossible nation that only exists because of God's miraculous supernatural hand and his sovereignty. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. So Abram, 75, he doesn't end up having a child till he's close to 100. That's a long time to wait. You know, when we read these things real in the stories, you know, like David being anointed king out of the shepherds all, you know, he's anointed king. Anointing Samuel, the prophet, pours oil over him out of obedience to God's command. David's anointed king. The next thing David does is go back to tend sheep for years. Years and years. He won't become king for another 15 years. So Abram, decades go by. Decades. Think about your last couple decades. If God promised you something back then, do you still believe it now? We can believe God at his word. And can you just click one more time? I was beyond faithful. Beyond faithful. Watch this. So Abram ends up having his child. Then later, this is what impressed God. And I'm going to show you how impressed he was. Abram, later, God says, I want you to sacrifice that child. I want you to go take him to the region of Moriah. I'll show you the mountain when you get there, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. Take your knife. And Abram, the only explanation is Abraham knows that if God can open up his wife's womb, and who was barren and now elderly, if he can do that, then whatever's going to happen on that mountain, when I sacrifice my son, something's going to happen. And I believe Abraham knew there'd be a resurrection. I personally believe that. Because he, with no questions asked, I'm not even sure if he told Sarah, by the way, honey, I'm taking the boy. What's the knife for, dear? You know, like, we don't have that conversation in the book of Genesis, but you got to wonder. But Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He knew that God was faithful, beyond faithful. So, sure enough, through 3 barren generations, God opens up wombs, and now you have the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob's son. Jacob's later renamed Israel. The tribes of Israel. Well, they go into Egypt. The story of Joseph, and I won't get into that, but they find themselves in Egypt. And over 400 years go by. And now a family of 70, Jacob's family, who went into Egypt, 400 years later, they're now 500,000. 500,000. They are now a nation. God raises up Moses. Why? Now this is what I want to get for you. I really want to bring this home. God sends Moses to Israel, not specifically for Israel. He did it for Abram. Think about that. Because God said something to Abram, and he was going to fulfill it. This is going to get even deeper. To a man who's dead, God remains faithful to his promise. Israel comes out, through all the parting of the Red Sea, all the plagues, and then the parting of the Red Sea. Moses leads 500,000 people through dry ground, by the way. It wasn't even muddy ground. That's God. And he sends them all through and closes up the Red Sea on Pharaoh's army, who's in hot pursuit. Now the enemy's gone, drowned into the heart of the sea, and Israel is dancing because God is faithful. Not just to Israel, to Abram. I want that to sink in. He made the promise to Abram. they're dancing. But the next day, they're grumbling. They're grumbling. So why did you take us out of Egypt when we were warm and well fed? Which was baloney, by the way. Isn't it amazing how short our memory is? When God pulls us out of a situation and goes, and I don't care if that's a relationship or a job or a house or whatever, he pulls you out and you go, oh, it was so beautiful back then. God knows what's best for you. And he knows what he needs to put in your life and what he needs to take out. We sing that. I used to hate it because I didn't understand it. He gives and takes away. He gives and takes. I thought, no, he doesn't. Now I'm 54. Yes, he does. And he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing because he's faithful, beyond faithful. So Israel's grumbling, and God responds with such grace. He says, I'm going to guide you with a pillar of fire during the night and a pillar of smoke during the day. You know what's cool about that? Is that when you're in the desert, it gets cool at night, but he warms them up. And then in the day, the sun is so hot, but he puts that cloud over to guard them from the sun. He becomes a supernatural thermostat. But at the same time, he's guiding them. He gets water from a rock. He says, Moses, strike that rock. And water gushes out to water 500,000 people. Okay? I can't even wrap my brain around that. Well, we're hungry. So God gives them fresh manna every day. Manna means, do you want to know what it is? I don't know, because manna means, what is it? And then quail would come out of nowhere at night. So you got this bread like manna in the morning, and then this quail at night every single day. Until the day God said, 40 years later, God said, it's time to go to the promised land. I'm obviously skimming over these stories, but God is faithful. And I want to tell you this. He's not faithful to Israel because of Israel. He's faithful to Abram. Then, all of a sudden, they get into the promised land, and who's the new leader? Moses is dead, Joshua 1 says. But Joshua, as God says, as I was with him, I will be with you. And Joshua now is the leader and takes Israel through these military campaigns to take Canaan, the promised land. Now, here's the other thing. Who did he promise Canaan to? Abram. That land. And so God, through a grumbling people, is being faithful to a dead man. That's God. That's our God. They no sooner get into Canaan and they start serving other gods. Well, then you get into the book of Judges. The book of Judges is this. There is no king because God is their king. But the book of Judges is this. Chapter 2 is actually the book report on it. Israel's serving other kings. So God would take serving other gods. So God would take a step back and go, all right, I give you no protection from the armies that are coming at you. The other armies would come and oppress Israel. They would call on the name of the Lord, and God would raise up a judge, someone who was listening to him, to rescue them from the neighboring countries. Israel is now rescued. As life goes on, Israel starts serving other gods. And God takes a step back. It says, I give you no protection to the surrounding armies. It's a tedious book, it really is. It happens, I believe, 12 times. That Israel rebels, God takes a step back, Israel cries out, God raises up a judge and rescues them. Israel rebels, God takes a step back, Israel cries out, and it goes on and on and on. But God is faithful to a rebellious people because he is good to his word. To a dead man. After the judges, all of a sudden God raises up kings. And we have King Saul that didn't work out all that great. So now we have King David. The best part of Israel's kingdom was King David. There was security on all sides. David was a fighter, and he conquered everybody around him, and Israel lived in safety. Then, of course, after David's son Solomon rises up, and there's such wisdom with Solomon that all the other countries would come annually to sit at Solomon's feet. The kings and queens of the other countries would come and sit at Solomon's feet and would bring truckloads, wagon loads, camels full of livestock and gold and jewels and jewelry, and would bring annually. So Israel's in its richest part. Solomon didn't end that well, because he ended up having 1,000 wives and concubines. And with all of them, a lot of them were foreign. And with a lot of them, he started building altars for their gods. You now have a multi-theistic Israel. But God is faithful. God is faithful. Now, going back to David, David was a man after God's own heart. They had a really neat relationship, but David was not perfect. But there's something about David. God said, I found a man, Samuel, a man after my own heart. And so he promises David, there will always be a king from your line on the throne in Israel. Well, after Solomon, Israel splits into two, north and south. North was known as Israel, and south was known as Judah, because God was faithful. Judah is where Jerusalem was, and Judah is where the line of David continually were on the throne. So even though Israel splits, God is faithful now to Abram, a dead man, and to David, a dead man. Isn't that amazing? Because God said it is done forever, because he's beyond faithful. After hundreds and hundreds of years of Israel constantly, North Israel constantly, bad kings, evil kings, serving other gods, rejecting God. In Judah, the line of David, some good kings, some bad kings, some, there's a good one. Oh, there's a couple bad ones, and it's kind of a roller coaster. But even though it's a roller coaster, and God is being rejected, he's still faithful. Are you catching that? He's faithful to what he said to Abram. He's faithful to what he said to David. And so, and then you have Babylon comes in and conquers everybody. I mean, first it was Assyria conquers Israel, then Syria comes in and conquers Assyria/Israel, and then Babylon comes in and wipes them all out. 70 years, Israel is now under Babylonian captivity, because God is trying to, he won't wipe them out, because he's faithful. There's a couple times he wanted to, but he didn't, because he's faithful. He's faithful. And so God is disciplining Israel, trying to get their attention back on him. Babylonian captivity, the book of Daniel, for 70 years. But then after 70 years, the Medes, Persians come in, wipe out Babylon, and let Israel rebuild the walls around Jerusalem and the temple, which Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed 7 years earlier. They no sooner build the walls and build the temple, and Israel starts serving other gods again. But God is faithful. This is going to land right in your lap in just a moment. For 400 years, God says, I'm not going to say anything. That's why in the book of Daniel, he outlines the 400 years and then goes, I'm taking a step back. I'm not saying anything nationally to people. I say nationally because when Jesus is born, we see his name escapes me. In the temple, we see, it's crazy. I've preached on that guy who dedicates, who's there at the dedication. That's hilarious. I can see all my, Simeon. Yeah, Simeon and Anna. are there, and God had talked to them. So he's talking to people individually, but he's not talking to Israel as a nation until he comes himself. Did you just hear the history of Israel? Why is he coming? Because he's faithful. And this is a great summary, or second addition to God is love. He loves you. He loves Israel, even though they're rejecting him. And he's faithful because he said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you into a great nation, even though they keep straight-arming him. Think about that. There's not one human alive that would be able to accomplish what God did. Even if you were being straight-armed for 5 years straight, are you still faithful? We don't understand God's love and his faithfulness because we have no human example of it, but we have God's historical example of it, especially when it comes to Israel. Now, Israel rejected Jesus, by the way, as a nation. There are still Jews who they consider themselves Messianic Jews who are saved and do recognize Jesus as Messiah, but nationally, in their religious system, they have rejected Jesus as the Messiah. But God is still faithful. Let's come to current day. There is no reason Israel should exist today. They didn't hold land. They were still a nation without land. Who does that? Until 1948. They are hated around the world. They are hated. Look at right now. They got Hezbollah coming from the north. They have other Arab nations coming in. I was in Bethlehem 7 years ago, 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and I had to walk through a huge wall. Why is the wall around? Not all the way around Bethlehem, just around where Bethlehem, which is an Arab nation, so it's part of the Arab nation, the West Bank, so that they can't come into Jerusalem or Israel proper. And the reason is the extremists of Hamas and Qatar were kept sending Unabombers into Jerusalem to Joppa Street, by the way, and we're blowing everything up. So they had to stop people from going into Israel. So they built this wall. I'm actually surprised with all the news that no one's talking about Bethlehem. I'm very intrigued by that. Regardless, there's no reason why Israel should exist and have such military might and power that they have. The Iron Dome it's almost supernatural, to be honest with you. They stop missiles at an exorbitant rate because God is faithful. Genesis chapter 12, we read it today. Almost 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, to a nation who has rejected God over and over and over and over and over again, he is faithful to a dead man. I'm going to make you into a great nation. He is faithful to David because who sits on the throne from the line of David? Jesus. He is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. So now what I want to say to you is, what has God said to you? Some of you aren't even listening. What would he have for me? God is faithful. God is faithful. My dad's in the hospital, but I can say to my mom right now, God is faithful. Jackie, God is faithful. Here you are. God is faithful. You can take God at his word. You can take God at his word. If he says no weapon formed against you will prosper, then by God, no weapon formed against you will prosper. The other part of that promise is that weapons will be formed against you. In this world you will find trouble. That's a promise. But fear not. I have overcome the world. And you are in... check this That I am in my Father, Jesus said. I'm in my Father, and my Father's in me, and I am in you, and you are in me. Hold on a second. I've been quoting this a lot, but I wanted to set the stage for this. 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. Here is a trustworthy saying. That's how it starts. Here's a trustworthy saying. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. But if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Jesus said, I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and I'm in you, and you're in me. He just put you all in a ball because he cannot disown himself. For him to disown you, even when you're being faithless, even when you're being stupid, he remains faithful because he cannot disown himself. Is there somebody here or online that feels like you've gone too far, or you're not enough for him, or whatever it is? I'm telling you that God is faithful to you. He's faithful to you. Maybe you feel like you haven't prayed in months. The amazing thing about a faithful God is as soon as you decide to say, Dear Lord, there he is. There's no conjuring him up. There's no egging him on. There's no leaving the holy water, whatever the heck that is, on the table so that he'll, maybe show up. He's faithful. He's faithful, and he's waiting for you to just turn his way. Let me give you one more way. God is faithful even to those that are not. I'm going out on a limb here. So Genesis 12, he gives a promise to Abram, which we just unpacked, is beyond faithful. Beyond faithful. Sorry about that. But if you turn a couple more chapters, Abram makes a little mistake. Not a little mistake, he makes a big mistake. And like I said, it was his belief that credited to him as righteousness. But because he was old, and because his wife was old, it was actually Sarai that said, Here, take my maidservant, take my concubine, and have a child. And sure enough, a son is born to Abram. His name's Ishmael. Isaac, the son of the promise of Genesis 12, would turn into the nation of Israel. The son, not of the promise, but yet a son of Abraham. Ishmael, God goes out into the wilderness to prophesy to his mother Hagar. That's how faithful God is, how loving God is. Because when Hagar got pregnant, Sarah got jealous and sent her away. Who follows poor Hagar that didn't ask to be part of any of this? She was just forced into the bed of Abraham. God goes after her. And listen to what he says to her. You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. Ishmael will grow into the Arab nations. The only reason the Arab nations exist right now is because of the faithfulness of God. Think about that. When I was in Bethlehem, there were three groups. There was, and I'm pretty sure, I wish I had, I almost texted Ed Dixon just to confirm, but I'm pretty sure it was Hamas, Qatar, and Christians. No Jews. Death. The Jews had assault rifles in army fatigue at the wall. That's where the Jews were. Not letting anyone in and out without their okay. My Lord, I didn't know that I needed my visa. And if I hadn't taken a picture of my visa for the travel agent earlier, I'd still be in Bethlehem today. Well, somebody I'm sure would have rescued me. Anyway, intense there. We went to visit Christian widows whose husbands were killed by the other two groups, the Arab groups, because they would not deny Jesus. And talk about a heart of mercy and forgiveness. They were teaching each other how to forgive. The other two groups, by the way, hated each other. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. The only time that the Arab nations come together is to fight Israel. They don't like each other. God's faithfulness. 5,000 years ago, God is faithful. And I'll put it right back on your lap. What has he said to you? Maybe specifically, he will do. He told me 7 years ago, when I became lead pastor at my former church, he sent a prophetess to come. I still have her prophecy on my laptop. And she said, you're going to pay a big price. I didn't know what that meant. But you are going to, if you're willing to take that, to eat it, I will create through you a place of refuge. And the prophetic word says to be a place of refuge for the pending doom, pending destruction that's going to come upon the nation. You're in a place of God's faithfulness here. He is faithful. And we just need to keep worshiping him and praising him, and like Abram, believing in him, even when it looks impossible. So what has God said to you? I think you really need to go in be still. Say, God, have I missed one of your promises for me, for my life? And really ask, what is it? And when he tells you, believe it. Because he's beyond faithful. And whatever he has put in your Bible, he is faithful. He who began a good work will be faithful to complete it until he comes again. Jesus, we ask for your soon return. We know that you've delayed because you want none to perish. So we'll do our part, spreading the good word, the good news, the gospel. But God, we just ache to be with you forever. And so they will be with the Lord forever. Until that day, God, I pray for strength. I pray for ears to hear, a heart to understand, even when our mind doesn't know. To know this love that surpasses knowledge. So God, I pray for our souls to be convinced, our spirit to be convinced. Even when our mind isn't. And we will worship you. And we will praise you. And we will gather together to experience you. And we believe in you. Lord, we renew our belief in you. Speak now. My job is done. Now start all of these conversations one-on-one to each one who are gathered here and online. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.